Call of Duty Ghosts might be the worst game I've ever played. Now, that requires a lot of qualification and humming and hawing and generally being annoying, but such is the cost of these things. Ghosts occupies an odd place within the megalithic franchise that is Call of Duty. At this point, it sits roughly in the middle, being the 10th main title in a series with 21 full banner annual releases. It begs us to ask, what is a Call of Duty? Well, back in the late 18th century, modern nation-states as we know them began to coalesce within a new ideology called nationalism, which will differentiate with a small n to distinguish it from the nationalist political movements that would arise in the 20th century. Within small n nationalism, people began to view themselves as part of a new national identity that encompassed or even superseded their local ethnic identities. This would lead to a bunch of stuff. As the story goes, when US soldiers started killing and dying during the Great War, it became necessary to start giving medals for doing a particularly admirable job of killing or dying. Additionally, it was felt that the US Medal of Honor had been handed out too frivolously during the Civil War, and the medal risked being trivialized as over 3,000 had been awarded. Okay, this is just... It turns out this was a huge boondoggle, actually a double boondoggle. Look, I had to play Call of Duty Ghosts like a dozen times to make this. Y'all are gonna sit there and listen to my goddamn research. President Woodrow Wilson ordered the War Department to do a review of the system, and the committee in turn revoked 911 Legacy Medals of Honor. Boondoggle 1 is that apparently in the Civil War, tons of Medals of Honor, being the only award the military had at the time, were handed out for some pretty suspect reasons. Many had been promised basically as a recruitment bonus, over 500 were awarded to a unit that had already gone home for a mission they didn't do, and Buffalo Bill wasn't even in the military at the time he did the thing that got him the medal. Boondoggle number 2 was that Buffalo Bill, for better or worse an American icon, had his Medal of Honor stripped from him the week that he died. Battlefield surgeon Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who got her recommendation from Sherman himself and spent 4 months of the war in a Confederate POW camp, was one of 9 civilian surgeons to be awarded the medal, and the only one to have it revoked. She was also the only woman to have ever, even to this day, been awarded the Medal of Honor. Just to not leave that story hanging, she refused to return it to Congress and wore it proudly until she died in 1919 at the age of 86. Congress did eventually reinstate her award in 1977. However, amidst the bureaucracy and sexism, a phrase was born. Miller, Oscar F., Major 361st Infantry, is awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the Call of Duty. And 85 years later, we've got a video game franchise. Since its inception in 2003, the Call of Duty first-person military shooter brand has produced 21 mainline titles and 22 spin-offs. Originating as a cinematic shooter in response to Electronic Arts' Medal of Honor games, which were themselves soft adaptations and expansions of the film Saving Private Ryan under the supervision of Steven Spielberg, the games are known for their giant set-piece levels, heavily scripted sequences, extensive voice cast, cutting-edge visuals, and just all-around high production value. Quickly though, let's introduce our corporate cast of characters. The franchise as a whole is published by Activision, now Microsoft Activision Blizzard King. The original game was developed by Infinity Ward, but after the success of the first game, Activision brought in a second studio, Treyarch, to begin working on a third game while Infinity Ward worked on the second. The idea being that the sequel would drop in 2005, and then Activision would already have a sequel to that game ready to go for 2006, which would give Infinity Ward 2 years to make the game after that, and then the game of Leapfrog would continue. Eventually, they would need to bring in 2 more studios, Sledgehammer and Raven, to wrangle the ever-ballooning scope, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. This plan for a yearly release paid off huge when the 4th game, subtitled Modern Warfare, smashed sales records and catapulted Call of Duty from being a merely successful franchise into being the video game franchise, a cultural shorthand for the idea of a video game. Indeed, Call of Duty was pushing the leading edge of production value so hard that the franchise became the definition of AAA video games. In the same way your grandmother could describe all video game consoles as a Nintendo, AAA video games could be simply a Call of Duty. Ghosts, released in 2013, is the 10th mainline title in the series, the 6th made by developers Infinity Ward. The game follows two brothers, Logan and Hesh Walker, as they shoot their way through a series of nonsense levels strung together by a jingoistic plot rooted deeply in American insecurity that was bubbling up as the global war on terror solidly entered its second decade. It is the near future. The, quote, great energy-producing deserts in the Middle East have been destroyed by war, cutting off much of America's energy, leading to a collapse and decline. In the power vacuum that followed, South America has been united or conquered under the banner of the Federation of the Americas, often simply referred to as the Fed. The game opens as two astronauts perform maintenance on the control station for the orbital weapon Odin, a kinetic bombardment system utilizing tungsten rods dropped from space, an impractical but popular pop culture weapon often shorthanded as rods from God. As they are performing the finishing checks on this decidedly military superweapon, the station is attacked and hijacked by Fed forces who gain entry by posing as an American supply shuttle. The Fed successfully target and bomb a large swath of Southern California, Texas, and Florida before the temporary prologue protagonist, or prologonist, destabilizes its orbit and burns up in the atmosphere. That sounds grammatically incorrect, so just to be clear, both the prologonist and Odin burn up in the atmosphere. Parallel to this, Elias Walker tells his sons the origin story of a fabled special ops team called the Ghosts.
It was a different time, a different enemy. 60 men from Tier 1 teams were sent to face down a force of 500 enemy fighters. Their objective? To force the enemy back from a civilian hospital and keep its occupants alive.
In this other backstory, in another time, another war, 60 men from a joint special ops team were tasked with guarding a hospital, and they get obliterated over the course of a couple nights. 60 become 15, and eventually these remaining 15, they evacuate the hospital and send one of their own as an escort. Then the remaining 14 cover themselves in blood and sand and hide under the bodies to ambush the enemy fighters. The prose in this story is florid, reverential, bordering on spiritual ecstasy. They are baptized with blood and anointed by the sand, then massacre the opposition with hit-and-run tactics that are so sick and badass that the one remaining enemy fighter goes crazy.
He expressed warnings to others of a force so menacing and unbeatable, it could only be described as supernatural. He called them ghosts.
God damn it, it's even got the ellipsis right there in the subtitles. I feel like this is what folding ideas sounds like to people who don't like folding ideas. This literal campfire story is then interrupted by the rods from God falling on San Diego as the Fed uses Odin to obliterate basically everything south of Santa Monica. The body of the game takes place 10 years later, long after the war with the Fed has come to a stalemate. It's not really relevant to anything, and you need to dig into the codex entries to sort it out, but basically the US military doesn't have branches anymore. It's all just one big blob, which is really just the underlying justification for the main characters, Logan and Hesh, to run around doing whatever the designers thought was cool. After a tutorial mission and some walk and talk, the boys are sent out to scout some Fed salvage operation back in San Diego, their first big mission beyond the massive border wall the US has built. They are assisted on their missions by the game's spectacle feature, Riley, a trained German Shepherd, and his doggy cam sneak attack. Despite the lengthy geopolitical setup and hell-dump of backstory, the game's lore is extremely front-loaded, and the meat of the game revolves around a man named Rourke, a ghost and Dad's former commanding officer. Oh, spoiler, Dad's a ghost, like that's why he knows all their backstory and stuff, but not like a cool ghost. He's an assassin, special ops, badass. It's treated as a twist. It's treated as a twist. They play it like it's a real twist that you didn't see coming.
But your father's not there anymore.
Dad, this whole time you were one of them.
Ghost. Try the ghost.
So Rourke, along with your dad, was one of the original 14 ghosts who were anointed with sand after defending the hospital, and his psych profile is basically that he's Rambo, but like Rambo 3 or Rambo 4 Rambo, not really First Blood Rambo. Rourke went missing in Caracas 2 years before the Odin incident and was presumed dead. When the Fed threatened all of South America and ordered all US-born residents killed or imprisoned, the US preemptively invaded Venezuela and sent the Ghost to assassinate Fed leadership in a mission that culminates in Federation leader General Almagro ordering a missile strike on a massive dam overlooking the city. Now, this self-destructive action here, we're going to have to set aside the fact that America's enemies are so insane they'll nuke themselves was already a recurring plot beat in the franchise by this point, so we can instead focus on the silliness of the scenario. If Western media gets accused of playing fast and loose with its audience's lack of knowledge of the rest of the world, few other instances will really compete with this game, stashing 1 billion gallons of water a kilometer in the air above the Caribbean Sea. So the ghosts do successfully assassinate General Almagro. You play as your dad Elias for this mission and shoot him yourself, but the helicopter crashes, Rourke falls into the water, and after weeks of searching for his body, the ghosts are pulled from Caracas and Rourke is declared MIA. Since he's the antagonist, he obviously survived, and now he holds a grudge against the ghosts for a combination of not rescuing him and not having the decency to die trying to rescue him. He was instead captured by the Fed and tortured in a jungle pit where they used all the old standards: isolation, temperature extremes, sleep deprivation, stress positions, keeping him wet, presumably direct physical and verbal abuse, and they feed him psychoactive poisons, implicitly ayahuasca. This process, stylized for the cinematic, blows all of the white off of him as black alien crystals burst out of his skin. That's interesting iconography. That might come up later.
Rourke was their ghost now. The perfect weapon to use against us.
He becomes the main villain of the entire game, and he's Bane, the Batman villain, specifically the Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, a 2 steps ahead criminal mastermind with seemingly limitless resources to pour into a plan that uses lofty geopolitical ambitions as a smokescreen for a personal grudge against a couple specific dudes. There's a series of Rourke-focused missions, including backstory, then an infiltration mission to find where he's hiding, an assault on the hideout, capturing Rourke, then getting hijacked by Rourke's people and dumped in the jungle, after which the game switches to hardcore filler mode. There's a winter science facility level in Chile, then an oil rig level in Antarctica, then an underwater level in the Atlantic, then a factory level in Brazil, somewhere north of Rio. After blowing up the factory, the team heads to a safe house in the remains of Las Vegas to hang out, where they get ambushed and captured by Rourke again.
You are right, Elias. I'm not a ghost. I'm the man that hunts them and sends them back to the other side. Dad, a ghost.
There's a sinking aircraft carrier, then a tank mission, and a second space mission, and then finally you fight Rourke on a train. The thing you learn in all of that faffing about, maybe a nugget per mission, is that the Fed has cloned Odin. That wreckage way back in the San Diego level where Doggy Cam was a mechanic, that was Odin, and I guess that information isn't exactly hidden, but it's really downplayed.
This is definitely the place. Stoker 6, we got something here. Looks like they're digging through some wreckage. What do you mean? What kind of wreckage? Not sure. It's guarded, but we're gonna push through.
It's actually kind of amazing how good a job the game does of making this theoretically important discovery feel utterly beneath notice. The crashed satellite looks unremarkable in the muddy brown gloom that pervades the game, and all leading lines direct the player away from it. You get a glimpse at the top of the hill, but the shape of the hill and the people shooting at you from down below pull your attention downwards and then to the left. When you exit the cave, the shooting is again coming from the left, pulling your view away from the crash site. Even when you exit the building and traverse a catwalk that goes right next to the satellite, the game makes sure there's people shooting at you off to the left, pulling your attention away from the wreckage. In glimpses and fragments, this crashed satellite just looks like indistinct industrial wreckage, a refinery or a silo of some kind, not a grounded weapon of mass destruction that's the reason everyone's in this mess in the first place. The only way to really appreciate that it's the wreckage of Odin is to sit around and explore, but this is a game that very much does not want you to explore. Cinematic shooters are 90% high-gloss hallways. That's kind of the core pitch. You trade freedom to wander for extremely intricate scripted sequences and spectacle. Wandering off is almost always tightly constrained. A door that you aren't explicitly directed to open will almost never open. A side hallway that isn't part of a shooting arena will almost always dead end quickly with nothing to see. In the case of the Odin wreckage, poking around is explicitly punished by falling into radioactive kill zones, sending you back to the previous checkpoint. Curiosity in the genre is structurally discouraged. So nominally, Logan and Hesh were sent to San Diego to figure out what the Fed is rooting around looking for, but when they find it, they just go, I don't know, some big busted thing. Looks expensive. And are then immediately derailed by Rourke capturing a ghost named Ajax, at which point the actual mission is discarded in lieu of meeting up with Ghost's Merrick and Keegan and heading off to rescue Ajax from the ruins of Dodger Stadium. So the fact that the Federation is rooting around in the wreckage of Odin is uncovered in Chapter 3 and then deemed so unremarkable that aside from a stray mention in Chapter 9, it isn't really relevant again until Chapter 13 when the team stumbles into a factory loading up Federation Odin clones, a project called Loki, named after the shape-shifting infiltrator that ends the world. Now, here's the very important thing to remember about Loki. It is said out loud to call your attention to this. The important thing to note about the clone of the orbital penetrating rod weapon of mass destruction built by the South Americans is that theirs is smaller. It's less girthy, it's not quite as potent, but it is significantly more numerous.
Yeah, these are smaller, but there's a lot more of them.
There might be some symbolism in there, I don't know. There's another space mission where Americans hijack Loki and start raining hell down on South America. You drive a tank, you fight Rourke on a train. You eventually shoot him and your brother, and all of the windows crack, like blow open, he drowns, and you and your brother sit on a beach watching the world burn as the credits start to roll before the inevitable and tragic sequel bait when an apparently immortal Rourke kidnaps Logan, that's you, and drags him off with a post-credits clip implying that Logan is being subjected to the same jungle drug torture brainwashing as Rourke was. So, Ghosts falls apart in basically every way. Like, if we're talking about a bad game, what are the ways in which a game can be bad? They can be just technically bad, unstable as software that doesn't launch right, crashes frequently, or breaks at the programming level. That's one type of bad. It can be just not particularly fun to push the buttons, like the responsiveness of it, or the feedback that you get, or the rewards that you get, the way that it respects or disrespects your time. Or it could be offensive on some narrative level. The story is full of holes, it isn't told in a way that carries the player through, character motivations are vague or thin, actions and consequences don't really seem to line up, and maybe it espouses some morally reprehensible worldview. Ghosts is all of these. So the long story short behind all this is twofold. One is simply that games of this scope take, as a rule of thumb, about 3 years to make, and Activision had their studios cranking them out in barely 2. While Ghost was not noted for its development crunch, this is because it was still so ubiquitous and normalized across the AAA industry in the early teens that it was deemed unremarkable. A contemporary Guardian article about the development of Ghost opens by talking about crunch in an extremely matter-of-fact way, like how you would say that being a sailor involves the risk of getting wet. The second is that around the release of Modern Warfare 2, Infinity Ward went through a major upheaval. Studio co-founders Vince Zampella and Jason West had wanted to sever Modern Warfare from the Call of Duty brand, getting Infinity Ward a bigger slice of the record-breaking pie. When Activision caught wind of this, all hell broke loose. The two were fired, then they sued Activision for basically manufacturing cause for their dismissal, then Activision countersued, calling them insubordinate and self-serving schemers who attempted to hijack Activision's assets for their own personal gain. This got very messy. It came out that Activision had a thing called Project Icebreaker that West and Zampella alleged was a scheme to oust them from Infinity Ward, while Activision insisted in their defense that Icebreaker was merely a scheme to spy on employee emails in order to improve the relationship with the studio. In the fallout, almost 4 dozen devs departed Infinity Ward in solidarity, leaving a big old hole in Infinity Ward's dev team. While Modern Warfare 3 would ultimately come out on time, it was only because Activision brought in Raven and Sledgehammer to help finish the game. Afterwards, it was decided that the 2-year leapfrog cycle just wasn't enough time, and thus the third game out from that point would be developed by Sledgehammer, starting a 3-studio rotation. All this required was for the folks at Sledgehammer to be brought fully up to speed, not just finishing assets for a game already in progress, but working from scratch with the new engine and all the various intricacies of making a Call of Duty. This added workload on the remaining Infinity Ward staff, creating a massive technical debt that would ultimately be paid by Ghosts. None of the problems that plague Ghosts are unique to it, rather Ghosts is unique for suffering from every single problem that plagues AAA video game production. I have taken the liberty, for the sake of pacing and shaking things up a bit, of organizing all that into a numbered list. The focus in development was on getting the game ready for the launch of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, which left the PC version in a pretty bad state, with numerous development problems leading to frequent crashes to desktop, broken script triggers, and numerous soft locks. They fixed a lot of this over the years. It is a lot more stable these days if you play it on a modern machine, but it's still really easy to softlock various levels because Call of Duty games are extremely complicated on a scripting level. If, in Chapter 2, you exit the tunnel into the LA River and immediately try and shoot down the helicopter, you can actually sort of shoot it down, but since it's supposed to come back later and you've already tripped the flag saying it's destroyed, it just never comes back for when you're actually supposed to shoot it down and the level soft locks.
I hear more literal birds than I hear helicopters. Alright, well, only one option.
The experience of the gameplay itself, is sluggish. Even sprinting feels more like a waddle. There's multiple vehicle segments that just do not function the way that you'd expect them to. The helicopter fights in particular have a very bizarre control scheme that I still do not fully understand. Lateral movement works more or less like you'd expect, even if it feels terrible, but altitude control is semi-automated within a very shallow layer. It's very awkward if you expect the helicopter to control like a helicopter. It's just kind of ugly. Even at the time, Call of Duty games were remarked on for being dominated by shades of brown, brown, green, gray-brown, and gray. Online comic strips like VG Cats were already mocking this trend in 2007, and yet 7 years later, Ghosts somehow takes that and makes it even worse. The brown-gray shooter has effectively become an archetype, and Call of Duty Ghosts is its avatar. The game's average color is taupe. This actually brings us to our next point, which we'll hand off to Folding Ideas' Mexican office. A major marketing point was the hiring of Oscar-winning screenwriter Stephen Gaghan to pen the script. Now, Gaghan won an Oscar for Traffic, a movie with its own, let's say, interesting relationship with Latin America. Traffic can be almost single-handedly credited with convincing audiences that Mexico looks like piss, which in turn became the visual language of hot places that are also dangerous, which became the visual language of war writ large, which is in part why Call of Duty Ghosts looks the way it does. In all fairness to Gaghan, I just happen to have a copy of the published shooting script, and it doesn't say anywhere, Mexico, a land the color of piss, everything is a shade of piss, even the sky. So that one's more on Soderbergh, or, well, Peter Andrews, who's just Steven Soderbergh with a Carhartt beanie and a Leica. Gaghan's pedigree as a writer is honestly, like most writers, a little mixed. He wrote Traffic and Syriana, but he also wrote Abandoned and The Alamo, and not relevant to Ghosts, but still funny, he would eventually write and direct the 2020 film Doolittle starring Robert Downey Jr.
Oh, good heavens!
The writing of a video game is complicated, more so for a game like Call of Duty than most, but there are elements that we can pretty safely put in Gaghan's lap, like the mission briefings with their absolutely tortured stoic prose.
The sand stuck to their skin like a shroud, changing them, anointing them.
This is just kind of a whirlpool of hell. The performances aren't saving the script, but the script isn't giving the performers material worth saving.
Dad, this whole time you were one of them. You're a ghost.
Try the ghost!
The bulk of the story is very stupid and is plagued with obvious backfills that are emergent from the way that the game is made. The cinematic shooter is so reliant on massive set-piece events that they have become the cart leading the horse. This aspect is basically an open secret of how the game and an embarrassing number of modern blockbusters are made, but it is rarely as obvious as it is with Ghosts. Cool moments were devised first, production was started, and artists and coders and scripters were put to work building a sinking aircraft carrier years before a writer would be sent in to figure out why an aircraft carrier is sinking. After all, enemy gunships and boats just move around on predefined paths. The exact model of helicopter, the flags being flown, or the uniforms on soldiers can all be swapped later. For a big part of the process, they're just floating cubes and other placeholders anyway. Even the dialogue and character interactions have the hallmarks of being as unintrusive and generic as possible. Characters are mostly an ephemeral presence barking immediate orders into your ears.
Sync on Riley. Move to the next floor.
The door's down! Flash now!
Keep an eye on your depth gauge.
Position clear!
Play your charges!
Logan, pick up Riley!
The why of what you're doing simply needs to be kept to a minimum presence so it can slot in easily at a later time. This is why every mission has, on average, one moment that actually matters. The character learns or accomplishes one thing, frequently by watching a video or reading a document, and the significance of that thing is more often than not shuffled into the interstitial monologues that serve as loading screens. You're sent to blow up an oil derrick off the coast of Antarctica in a bluff to lure away the Fed's Navy, but that doesn't make any sense. Not as a plan and not as the motivation driving you through the mission. It's simply the results that you're told afterwards, and then later that diverted Navy just shows up and sinks the US's last remaining aircraft carrier anyway. The crashed Odin in Chapter 2 is so conspicuously unremarked upon that it's entirely possible that it wasn't even decided what rubble the Fed soldiers would be searching through at the time the mission was started. Like, not to get repetitive here, but this is the full exchange.
This is definitely the place. Stoker 6, we got something here. Looks like they're digging through some wreckage. What do you mean? What kind of wreckage? Not sure. It's guarded, but we're gonna push through.
You don't interact with it, it's surrounded by killer radiation, so you can't try and do anything with it. Merrick and Keegan don't ask about it, and despite the fact that you were sent out explicitly to figure out what the Fed were doing in San Diego, this information is seemingly never relayed. The thought that the Fed is trying to salvage Odin in order to make their own isn't floated as a possibility, even as the characters are watching the Fed launch mystery ballistic missiles that NORAD loses track of after launch.
NORAD was able to say conclusively, the missile launched in the Yucatan did not hit the USA.
There isn't even a beat where a character puts two and two together the moment that they walk into the room and see Loki being loaded up. Even the bit with Loki is like, okay, they walk into the room, they see something, there's a bunch of radio chatter about it, and then they move on. This level could be 95% completed without the artists even knowing what's going to go in that slot. These events, these thoughts, are all siloed from one another, interacting only through the narrow tunnels between missions. There is simply zero internal cohesion to the story. It's so obviously and shoddily a series of set pieces that were hastily strung together. It's actually difficult to keep them in order in the memory simply because there's so little logical connection between them. In the game, you infiltrate the lab to get files on the missile program, blow up the oil derrick to lure away the Navy, then sink the last destroyer guarding Brazil so you can sabotage the factory. But we could just as easily make it that during the factory sabotage mission, we uncover Loki. Then we blow up the destroyers so we can get access to the oil derrick, which as a 1-2 punch will lure the Navy in the Pacific towards the Atlantic so we can infiltrate the lab and steal the access codes needed to subvert Loki. All it would need to replace is a few lines of dialogue and the interstitial monologues. Other missions are less egregious, but never properly escape this artifact of their creation. Missions are in the order that makes a reasonable amount of narrative sense while breaking up the mechanics. Many of these set pieces are extremely obvious in their influences. Again, it's basically an open secret that Call of Duty level designers just look for moments from movies and go, wouldn't it be cool if you could play that? But I don't know, it just feels so hack when the inspiration is so obvious. Rourke allows himself to be captured for no particular reason except that it allows the game to recreate the opening of The Dark Knight Rises. One level is lifted in pretty equal measure from The Dark Knight and Transformers Dark of the Moon. The game doesn't really have mechanics, it has the simulation of mechanics. In a typical game, hell, let's get saucy and say, in a real game, the player is given a suite of interactions that they can perform, and it is then given to the player the freedom to figure out how to best string together these interactions to accomplish their goals. Ghosts instead gives you a gun and a context prompt. Things like night vision goggles, thermal optics, the dog Riley, a blinding strobe light, a motion tracker, and gas grenades aren't tools that you are given, tutorialized on, and then expected to deploy at your discretion. They are gimmicks that pop up at predetermined moments and persist in your toolkit for only as long as deemed necessary.
Logan, sync up with Riley. Here we go.
Now, there are a lot of compromises that are made in the service of the cinematic in cinematic shooter. The player is ultimately on rather tight rails with little freedom in how they approach the world. This is not inherently bad. Roller coasters are literally on rails, and roller coasters are really, really fun. And at a certain level of abstraction, this is true about basically every game with a linear story. Using Doom 2016 as an example, while the player can backtrack through large areas of the game for a substantial chunk of the playtime, this is ultimately little more than the freedom to hunt for collectibles, as the actual bang bang pew pew rip and tear gameplay remains constrained to a predetermined chute you must climb into if you want to rip cacodemon eyeballs out. The argument in favor of rails is that they are needed to provide a kind of tightly crafted experience that a freer sort of sandbox environment just can't deliver. But with that comes an unspoken contract, that I, as a player, am ceding an amount of control in exchange for something impactful, and the expectations that the rails will be reasonably well disguised. I shouldn't feel the rails, because the path forward should simply be the one that I most want to go down. This way for cacodemons and their eyeballs. Call of Duty Ghosts is littered with so many friction points, the poorly laid out levels, the obnoxious characters, the incoherent story, that the illusion, the buy-in, just falls apart. You begin to notice that you're thrust into situations where tools you were given earlier would be useful, but you don't have them, because they weren't actually tools in the first place, they were single scene gimmicks. There is a veneer of realism here in the sense that your commandos aren't going to be showing up with the same ever-ballooning kit of toys to every single mission, but that realism shreds like tissue paper when a very useful tool like the strobe light is only functional within a single specific room. The fake commitment to realism results in frankly boring gunplay. While you will occasionally stumble across a shotgun or machine gun, by and large you will spend the campaign cycling through a series of indistinct assault rifles. Step after boring step of the game is saturated with barked orders from your commanding officers who perpetually sound pissed off that they even need to deal with you, giving the distinct impression that the game not only feels obliged to hold your hand, but resents doing it too.
You can stick with us, but you do what I say when I say it, understood?
Put all in a package, Ghosts is a great simulation of what an escort quest must feel like from the perspective of the NPC. Help, I'm trapped in a numbered list factory, the bosses stole my passport, if you're reading this, tell my wife I'm still alive, please send rescue. Ghosts are cringe. The amount of worshipful religious prose that is poured out talking about the ghosts is weird and embarrassing, especially given that the source of most of that is Elias talking about himself.
And this really happened.
So the legend goes.
But it really reaches the next level after Elias is killed. In the story, the ghosts are a quasi-official interdepartmental unit consisting entirely of 14 people. There were 15 soldiers left at the hospital, one of them was sent to escort evacuees, 14 stayed behind to be anointed by sand. That event, in and of itself, is within the lifetime of all of the game's characters. Merrick, Rourke, Elias, Ajax, and Keegan were all there. They are first-generation ghosts. Logan and Hesh are implied to be the first initiated ghosts ever. From the events of the game, the ghosts are depicted as both quite new, very exclusive, and badass to the point that prior to Rourke killing Ajax, the unit has suffered 0 confirmed casualties. So, with all of this framing, it's all just so deeply cringe when Hesh spends a loading screen detailing all the ghost funerary rites and customs like they're a deeply rooted tradition with generations of practice.
In the event a ghost is killed, his remains are placed face down, with his head pointed in the direction of his home, his weapon next to him. We do it this way, so that when our fallen are taken to the other side, they can watch over us and keep an eye on our enemy.
Let's talk about the dog. Ghosts had 2 big elements that became the backbone of the marketing campaign for the game. The lesser of these is the aforementioned hiring of Oscar-winning screenwriter Stephen Gaghan to pen the script. The big one was Riley the dog.
This is someone you care about. This is a squad member. He does everything from sniffing out explosives to protecting the team.
Riley is only mechanically available to the player in 2 chapters. He's less like a squad member and more like a specialty grenade that you have access to for 3 specific gunfights. He's barely in the game. There's a whole thing in chapter 14, that's the one where your dad dies, and Riley kind of appears out of nowhere and then gets shot, and you need to carry him through the rest of the level. After that, they show him at the start of the aircraft carrier mission, the one where the carrier sinks, but since there's a 3 days later fade in between, Riley is just sort of quietly ushered out of existence in the uncertainty of that transition. The political undercurrents of the story are repulsive and reflect the madness of an America trapped in a quagmire of its own making and desperate for a new villain. Diegetically, America is on the back foot, is in decline following the collapse of the, quote, energy-producing deserts, and is embroiled in a defensive war against a superior foe. At least, that's what we're told. Since so much of the story is really about Rourke's personal grudge, the geopolitics sink into the distant background. America being in some nebulous decline is simply the prerequisite to justify the conflict, to make it a fair fight. America built an orbital weapon of mass destruction when they were in decline, so, take that for what it's worth. So let's actually look at how Rourke fits into all of this thematically. We have this soup of action set pieces strung together by a plot written around them. What emerges from that soup? The theme that comes through, loud and clear, is that Rourke gives the Fed their potency. The plan to hijack Odin is cooked up by Rourke. The attack on Santa Monica is Rourke, and Loki is Rourke's doing. All the various filler tasks ultimately revolve around getting ahead of Rourke. Rourke is an attempt at de-racializing an inherently racialized conflict. You simply cannot have a conflict between the United States and Venezuela without invoking the specter of US interventionism in South America.
What do you mean by political? That doesn't mean anything, right? The question, is this a political game, doesn't actually mean anything, because it's what does the word political mean to you? Do we touch topics that bear a resemblance to the geopolitics of the world we live in today? Hell yeah, because this is that is the subject matter of modern warfare.
Despite the developers' insistence that their games are simply good, sugary fun that happens to resemble something in the shape of geopolitics, kind of like a candy cigarette, they do remain aware of the implications of the things they make, and in the early teens were visibly sensitive to the pushback. They received criticism for how the Arab factions in Call of Duty 4 were depicted, with a nuclear suicide bombing, so Modern Warfare 2 instead revolves around the threat of a duplicitous US general, and then in Modern Warfare 3 it was revealed that the nuke had actually been the machinations not of al-Assad, but of that game's antagonist, Vladimir Makarov. Rourke is in one sense a safe antagonist. It makes the game about Americans fighting Americans, white people fighting a white person whose most vocal motivation is simple revenge. However, in the same way that the levels are generic vessels for MacGuffins to be placed into at a later date, the natural endpoint of a production pipeline that demands endless crunch, Rourke is the endpoint of corporate cowardice. There is a potentially insightful conclusion down the path of the greatest threat to America is America itself, but this is not that. The message here isn't civil. It's not suggesting that America has invested so much in outward strength that it has become internally brittle, that the contradictions of American existence threaten the concept of America itself. The vulnerability isn't American hubris. The vulnerability is American subversion. The game plays to the sensibilities of an America in tension with the war on terror, the war in Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan. As these wars were solidly entering their second decade, the narrative of a righteous war, always suspect in the first place, was decidedly faltering. America's presence was clearly not a stabilizing force, and they had become an intractable quagmire. So in Ghosts, the Middle East is simply written out of the picture in passive voice, the destruction of the oil-producing deserts. No one's fault, just a thing that happened. The Fed, which is to say South America, is described as invasive, creeping, consuming, an inexorable force moving northwards to take over America for no reason but conquest. In the cutscenes, they are an organic, oily mass crawling across the map and staining it. They are a perverting force, a subverting enemy that will invade American space, take America's things, and turn them against America. The enemy is both impossibly strong and utterly impotent. Their power is not strength in their own right, but their ability to pervert. Rourke does not become disillusioned with America. That's not why he switches sides. While he definitely harbors a grudge against specific individuals, his heel turn is fully explained as brainwashing. He is tortured and drugged and converted into their ghost. And there's that imagery. As the Federation torturers go to work on his soul, the whiteness is literally blasted off him, and black crystals rupture out of his body as he becomes their operative. In an attempt at telling an underdog story, Ghosts creates a world where American paranoia is fully justified, where American orbital weapons are good and right, but Federation orbital weapons are an abomination, and also decidedly less potent, but more numerous. It is a world where the Fed is wrong to see America as an existential threat and behave accordingly, but it is simply pragmatic for America to assassinate Federation leadership. The hordes are coming, they're sending their murderers, their drug dealers, and their rapists to corrupt America. The wall is simply a necessity. I don't think much, if any of this, is intentional. Rather, it is my belief that Call of Duty Ghosts is a thoughtless product. These are the consequences of a bad, albeit Oscar-winning writer simply trying to paint a broad-stroke scene to efficiently communicate a stupid plot to an inattentive audience after he was handed a pile of half-built set pieces and a vague corporate mandate for the overall shape and tone. But in that thoughtlessness, in the reliance on stereotype and trope, Ghost tapped into an anxiety of the moment it was created in, a desperate need for America to be righteous and justified, for its paranoia to be a foresight of something real. Given that we are now living in the consequences of that paranoia, the odious results of that anxiety, I find Call of Duty Ghosts repulsive. The worst game I have ever played.
Wow, that sure was an episode, wasn't it? And to think, he didn't even get around to mentioning the fish AI, the role of NORAD as the US military's head command, seemingly implying that Canada has been annexed, the controversy of the developers reusing motion capture data from Modern Warfare 2, the reality of American energy production, or the fact that Eminem's song Survival was released as a pre-order bonus. Well, anyway, it's a long way back to Canada from here in Mexico, where I most certainly am because I am in Mexico and most definitely not in southern Alberta, so I'm going to get right on moseying. Until next time, keep your tangos frosty and your LZ cleared.